The dust rose in clouds behind Tabitha Wright's worn boots as she stumbled over yet another rock on the path back to her father's farm, sending the bucket of well water splashing across her already stained dress. And in that moment, she wondered if perhaps everyone in Kearney, Nebraska, was right about her being cursed with the worst luck a woman could have. It was the summer of 1876, and the town had spoken her name with a mixture of pity and superstition for as long as she could remember. 21 years of mishaps, accidents, and calamities that seemed to follow her like a shadow, earning her a reputation no young woman wanted in a frontier settlement where prospects for marriage were already scarce. The water soaked through the cotton fabric, cold against her skin despite the June heat. Tabitha sighed and looked down at the nearly empty bucket, knowing her father would shake his head in that way he did, not with anger but with a tired resignation that hurt worse than any scolding. She picked up her pace, her honey-colored hair escaping from its braid to stick to her damp neck. The Wright farm sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest plot of land that her father worked from sunup to sundown, trying to coax life from soil that seemed determined to resist his efforts. People said the land itself was unlucky, but Tabitha knew her father had bought it cheap because no one else wanted it, and he had been too kind-hearted to turn away the opportunity to give his daughter a home after her mother died bringing her into this world. That was the first bit of bad luck attributed to Tabitha, though she could hardly be blamed for the complications of her own birth. Still, the town remembered. They remembered when she was 5, and the church caught fire during Sunday service, starting from a candle that toppled near where she had been sitting. They remembered when she was 12, and the schoolhouse roof collapsed the day after she had stayed late to help the teacher. They remembered 3 years ago when Jacob Morrison had been courting her, and his prize horse broke its leg the very day he planned to propose, forcing him to sell half his herd to pay the veterinarian, after which he quietly stopped calling on her. Tabitha reached the farmhouse, a simple structure with a sagging porch that her father kept promising to fix. She set the half-empty bucket down and went back inside to fetch a towel, trying to pat herself dry before her father saw. But Thomas Wright was already coming in from the field, his face weathered and lined from years under the sun, his hands calloused and strong despite his 50-some years. "Another accident, Tabby?" he asked, and there was that gentle sadness in his voice. "The path is uneven," she said, which was true, though it did not explain why she was the only one who seemed to trip on it daily. Her father crossed the small kitchen and put a hand on her shoulder. "You are a good daughter. Do not let this town make you believe otherwise." Tabitha felt the familiar sting behind her eyes but refused to let tears fall. She had cried enough over the years, and it changed nothing. Instead, she changed into a dry dress and went about preparing their supper, carefully keeping her attention on every movement so as not to burn the beans or cut herself chopping vegetables, though both had happened more times than she could count. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and pink, Tabitha heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. They lived far enough from the main road that visitors were uncommon, and her heart sank as she wondered what new disaster might be arriving at their door. But when she looked out the window, she saw a single rider, a man she did not recognize, leading a horse that was limping badly. Her father went out to meet him, and Tabitha followed, wiping her hands on her apron. The stranger was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He wore dusty riding clothes and a hat that had seen better days, and when he dismounted, Tabitha noticed the way he moved with a careful grace, as though his body knew how to react before his mind had to think about it. "Sorry to trouble you, sir," the stranger said, his voice low and polite. My horse picked up a stone and I need to tend to her before we go any further. Saw your place from the ridge and hoped you might have some water to spare. Of course, Thomas said. Tabitha, fetch the bucket. She hurried to get the water, acutely aware that it was only half full because of her earlier spill, but the stranger did not seem to notice or care. He spoke softly to his horse, a pretty bay mare with intelligent eyes, and Tabitha watched as he gently lifted the injured hoof and worked the stone free with a practiced touch. There you go, girl, he murmured. You will be fine now. Are you passing through? Thomas asked. Planning to stay, actually, the man said, straightening up and extending his hand. Name is Garrett Young. I hired on at the Double R Ranch starting tomorrow. Thought I would make it to town before dark, but I left later than I should have. Thomas shook his hand. Tabitha Wright. This is my daughter, Tabitha. Garrett turned to her, and when their eyes met, Tabitha felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she had not known was closed. He tipped his hat to her, and she saw a genuine smile cross his face, not the nervous or pitying expressions she was used to from men in town. Pleased to meet you, Miss Wright, he said. And you, Mr. Young, she managed, surprised her voice came out steady. You are welcome to stay for supper, Thomas offered. It is not much, but you look like you could use a meal before you head into town. Garrett hesitated, as though not wanting to impose, but Tabitha could see the hunger in the way he glanced toward the house, and she found herself saying, Please, we have plenty. It was not entirely true, but her father's expression showed he agreed with the invitation, and so Garrett accepted with gratitude. He tended to his horse first, making sure the mare was comfortable in their small stable with fresh water and some of their precious hay, and then he washed up at the pump while Tabitha hurried inside to stretch their meal as far as it would go. Supper was simple fare: beans, cornbread, and some salt pork her father had been saving. Tabitha served it carefully, waiting for something to go wrong, for a dish to slip from her hands or the food to somehow be ruined, but nothing happened. They sat at the rough-hewn table, and Garrett ate with appreciation, complimenting the cooking in a way that made Tabitha's cheeks warm. Where are you from? Thomas asked. Kansas originally, Garrett said. Been working ranches since I was 14. Heard the Double R was looking for experienced hands, and I thought Nebraska might be a good place to settle for a while. It is decent land if you are willing to work it, Thomas said. The town is small but growing. Good people for the most part. Tabitha kept quiet, knowing her father was being generous. The people of Kearney were no better or worse than anywhere else, but they were superstitious, and they had long memories for the wrong things. What about you folks? Garrett asked. Been here long? 21 years, Thomas said. Came right after the war. Wanted a fresh start, and this land was available. It has been hard at times, but it is home. Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. I lost my family during the war, been on my own since. Ranching is what I know, and it is enough. There was a moment of shared silence, the kind that came when people recognized similar losses in each other. Tabitha rose to pour coffee, an extravagance they rarely indulged in, but her father had insisted for their guest. As she reached across the table to fill Garrett's cup, her sleeve caught the edge of his plate, and she felt the familiar rush of panic as it teetered toward the edge. But Garrett's hand shot out, faster than she would have thought possible, catching the plate before it fell. He steadied it and looked up at her with those autumn water eyes, and instead of irritation or the nervous fear she often saw, he simply smiled. Quick reflexes, he said easily. Comes from working with cattle and horses. They will teach you to move fast. It was such a casual comment, turning what could have been another disaster into nothing worth noting, and Tabitha felt something loosen in her chest. She finished pouring the coffee without incident and sat back down, sneaking glances at this stranger, who seemed entirely unbothered by her near accident. They talked as the evening deepened, and Tabitha learned that Garrett was 25, that he preferred horses to cattle but worked with both, that he had once seen a tornado touch down so close he could feel the pull of it in his bones, and that he played the harmonica though not very well. He asked about the town, about the farm, and when he directed questions to Tabitha, he listened to her answers with genuine interest, as though her opinions on the best time to plant corn or whether the winter would be harsh actually mattered. When the meal was finished and the coffee gone, Garrett stood and thanked them both. "I should get into town before full dark. Thank you for your kindness. It has been a long time since I sat at a family table." "You are welcome back any time," Thomas said, and Tabitha could tell he meant it. Her father was a good judge of character, and he clearly approved of this young cowboy. Garrett retrieved his horse and mounted with an easy swing that spoke of years in the saddle. Before he rode off, he looked down at Tabitha and said, "I hope I will see you again, Miss Wright." "Perhaps in town sometime." "Perhaps," she said, trying not to sound too hopeful. She watched him ride away until the darkness swallowed his silhouette, and then she turned to find her father watching her with a thoughtful expression. "He seems like a good man," Thomas said carefully. "He does," Tabitha agreed, not trusting herself to say more. That night, lying in her narrow bed under the sloped ceiling of her small room, Tabitha allowed herself to think about Garrett Young. She knew better than to let her hopes rise too high. Every time she had dared to believe something good might happen, her luck had proven otherwise. But there was something about the way he had caught that plate, the ease with which he had dismissed the near accident, that made her wonder if perhaps not everyone saw her as cursed. The following days fell into their usual rhythm. Tabitha helped her father with the farm work, mended clothes, tended their small vegetable garden, and tried to avoid the pitying or wary looks when she went into town for supplies. She saw Garrett once from a distance, riding with other men from the Double R, but he did not see her, and she told herself it was just as well. Then came Saturday, and the town held its weekly market in the square. Thomas needed to sell some eggs and buy seed, and Tabitha came along to help carry packages. The market was busy, full of farmers and ranchers, townspeople and travelers, all doing business under the hot June sun. Tabitha kept to herself, acutely aware of the way conversations sometimes paused when she passed, the way mothers pulled their children a little closer. She was examining a bolt of fabric at one of the stalls, knowing she could not afford it but enjoying the feel of the cloth under her fingers, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Wright, what a pleasant surprise." She turned to find Garrett standing there, cleaned up from his ranch work, his hair damp as though he had recently dunked his head in a trough, a smile on his face that made her heart skip. "Mr. Young," she said. "How are you finding the Double R? Hard work but good," he said. "The foreman is fair and the other hands are decent enough. I am learning the land." He glanced at the fabric she had been touching. "That is a nice color, brings out your eyes." Tabitha felt heat rise in her cheeks. No man had ever commented on her eyes before, at least not favorably. "I was just looking. We do not need any fabric right now." "Still, it is nice to look at pretty things," he said, and she was not entirely sure if he meant the fabric or something else. They walked together through the market, and Tabitha was intensely conscious of the stares they were attracting. She could almost hear the whispers, the warnings Garrett would surely receive once she was out of earshot. He seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply did not care, stopping at various stalls to examine tools or tack, asking her opinion as though she were an expert. I need new gloves, he said, holding up a pair of worn leather ones. These have about one more week in them. Those over there look sturdy, Tabitha said, pointing to a stall across the way. Mr. Henderson makes them himself. They cost more, but they last. They headed toward the leather goods stall, and Tabitha did not see the loose board in the walkway until her foot caught it. She pitched forward with a cry, bracing for the impact with the hard-packed dirt, but strong arms caught her, pulling her upright before she could fall. Garrett steadied her, his hands warm on her arms, his face close to hers. Careful there. These walkways are a hazard. The town should fix them before someone breaks an ankle. He released her once he was sure she had her balance, and Tabitha stared at him in amazement. Twice now he had prevented her accidents, and twice he had acted as though it were nothing unusual, as though anyone might trip and catching them was simply the decent thing to do. "Thank you," she whispered. "Anytime," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. They reached the leather goods stall, and while Garrett examined gloves, old Mr. Henderson watched Tabitha with rheumy eyes. "You best be careful, young man," he said to Garrett in a voice meant to be low but which carried anyway. "That girl is bad luck. Everyone knows it." Tabitha felt her stomach drop, humiliation washing over her like cold water. She started to turn away, to flee before she had to see the doubt or fear enter Garrett's expression, but his voice stopped her. "I do not believe in luck, good or bad," Garrett said calmly, still examining the gloves. "I believe in choices and hard work, and I believe in treating people with respect." He looked up at Henderson then, and there was steel beneath the polite tone. "Miss Wright has been nothing but kind and helpful to me. I will take these gloves, and I will thank you not to speak ill of her in my presence again." He paid for the gloves, took Tabitha's arm gently, and steered her away from the stall. She was shaking, caught between mortification and a fierce gratitude that made her throat tight. "You did not have to do that," she said when they were out of Henderson's earshot. "Yes, I did," Garrett said. "I meant what I said. I do not hold with superstition, and I do not like seeing someone mistreated." "You do not understand," Tabitha said, stopping to face him. "It is not just superstition. Things really do go wrong around me, always have. I have lost count of the accidents, the mishaps. People are not wrong to be wary." Garrett studied her for a long moment, his expression serious. "Has it occurred to you that maybe accidents just happen? That life is unpredictable, and sometimes we are in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it does not mean anything more than that. You do not know what it has been like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I do not," he agreed. "But I know what I see. I see a woman who works hard, who takes care of her father, who is kind to strangers. I see someone who has been carrying a burden that is not hers to carry." He paused, then added softly, "I see someone I would very much like to know better if she would let me." Tabitha's breath caught. She searched his face for any sign of pity or false bravado, but found only honest interest and a quiet determination. "People will warn you about me." "Let them," Garrett said. "I make my own decisions." They stood in the middle of the busy market, people flowing around them, and Tabitha felt as though she were standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Every instinct told her to protect this man from the misfortune that seemed to follow her, to walk away before something terrible happened to him. But another part of her, a part that had been silent and small for so long, whispered that maybe, just maybe, Garrett Young was different. "I would like that too," she said finally, "to know you better." His smile could have lit the whole territory. "Then let me take you to the church social next Sunday. I hear there is going to be music and dancing." "I am not much of a dancer," Tabitha warned. "I tend to trip over my own feet." "Then we will trip together," Garrett said easily. I already told you I am terrible at the harmonica. We can be untalented together." Despite everything, Tabitha laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in her chest, and it felt like breaking through ice into sunlight. "All right," she said. Sunday. They parted ways shortly after, as Garrett needed to return to the ranch and Tabitha had to find her father, but she felt lighter than she had in years. When she found Thomas at the seed merchant, he took one look at her face and smiled. "I take it you ran into young Mr. Young," he said. "He asked me to the church social," Tabitha said, still half disbelieving, "and you said yes, I hope." "I did, but Papa, what if something happens? What if my luck affects him?" Thomas set down the bag of seed he had been examining and took both her hands in his. "Tabby, my dear girl, you have let this town convince you that you are somehow responsible for the random chances of life. I have watched you grow up believing you are cursed, and it has broken my heart. If this young man sees you for who you truly are, then let him. Let yourself be happy. You deserve it more than anyone I know." Tears pricked Tabitha's eyes, but they were different from the tears she usually cried. These came from a place of hope rather than despair. She hugged her father there in the middle of the merchant's stall, not caring who saw. The week, until Sunday, crawled by with agonizing slowness. Tabitha threw herself into work, trying to keep her mind occupied, but found herself daydreaming at odd moments, remembering the sound of Garrett's voice, the way he had caught her when she stumbled, the conviction in his tone when he defended her to Henderson. She washed and mended her best dress, a simple blue cotton that was nevertheless the nicest thing she owned. She braided and re-braided her hair a dozen times, practicing different styles. Saturday night, she barely slept, alternating between excitement and dread. What if something terrible happened at the social? What if her presence caused some disaster that hurt people? She almost talked herself out of going 100 times, but each time she remembered Garrett saying he did not believe in luck, that he believed in choices, and she chose to be brave. Sunday dawned clear and bright, not a cloud in the sky. Tabitha dressed carefully, braiding her hair in a crown around her head the way her mother used to wear hers, according to the photograph that sat on the mantel. Her father proclaimed her beautiful, and she felt her cheeks flush with pleasure and nervousness. Garrett arrived at their farm in the early afternoon, riding his bay mare and leading a gentle old gelding from the ranch that she could ride into town. He wore clean clothes and a newer hat, and when he helped her onto the horse, his hands were sure and steady. "You look lovely," he said, and the admiration in his eyes made her feel like she truly was. They rode into town together, Tabitha acutely aware of the picture they made. By tomorrow, everyone in Kearney would know that the unlucky Wright girl was being courted by the new cowboy from the Double R. She could not decide if that would be good or bad for Garrett's reputation. The church social was held in the large grassy area behind the white clapboard church, with tables set up for food and a space cleared for dancing. Someone had brought a fiddle, and another man had a guitar, and the music was already playing when they arrived. People were scattered in groups, talking and laughing, children running between the adults in games of tag. Tabitha felt the attention shift to them immediately. Conversations paused, heads turned, and she saw the speculation and concern on people's faces. Garrett seemed to notice none of it, greeting people pleasantly as they made their way to the food tables. Several of the ranch hands from the Double R called out to him, and he introduced Tabitha to them with a pride that made her stand a little straighter. They filled plates with food that the various townswomen had brought: fried chicken, potato salad, biscuits, pies, and cakes. Garrett found them a spot under a large oak tree at the edge of the gathering, and they sat on the grass, balancing their plates on their laps. "This is nice," Garrett said, looking around at the gathering. "Reminds me of when I was young before the war. My town used to have socials like this." "Do you miss it? Your hometown?" Tabitha asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But you cannot go back, can you? The place I remember does not exist anymore. Too many people gone, too much changed. Better to make a new home somewhere that has a future." "And you think Kearney could be that home?" He looked at her, something intense and warm in his gaze. "I am beginning to think so." They ate and talked, and Tabitha found herself relaxing despite her nervousness. Garrett had a way of making conversation easy, asking questions that drew her out, sharing stories of his own that made her laugh. He told her about a time he had fallen off a horse into a creek and emerged covered in mud, about the ranch cat that followed him around like a dog, about the sunset he had seen his first night in Nebraska that had convinced him he had made the right choice to come here. When the dancing started, Garrett stood and offered his hand. "I believe I promised you a dance, Miss Wright." Tabitha hesitated, looking at the couples already moving to the music. "I really am terrible at dancing." "And I really meant it when I said we would be terrible together," he countered. "Come on. I did not put on my best shirt to sit under a tree all evening." She let him pull her to her feet, and they joined the other dancers. Garrett took her hand and put his other on her waist, and they began to move to the music. He was not lying about being untalented. His rhythm was slightly off, and he stepped on her foot twice, but he laughed about it. And she found herself laughing too, the nervousness melting away. They spun and swayed, and Tabitha concentrated so hard on not tripping that she forgot to be self-conscious. When the song ended and another began, Garrett kept her in his arms and they danced again. Other couples moved around them, and if people were staring or whispering, Tabitha no longer cared. She felt light, almost giddy, as though she had shed a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. After several dances, they took a break to get lemonade, and as they stood by the drinks table, a woman approached. She was perhaps 30, with a kind face and a no-nonsense manner. Tabitha recognized her as Sarah Mitchell, wife of one of the town's merchants. "Miss Wright," Sarah said, "I wanted to say your father's eggs are always the freshest. I hope he will bring more next week." It was such a normal, friendly comment that Tabitha was momentarily speechless. Sarah had never gone out of her way to speak to her before. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell," Tabitha managed. "I will tell him." Sarah nodded to Garrett and moved away, and Tabitha realized that Sarah had deliberately chosen to speak to her in front of Garrett, in front of others. It was a small thing, but it felt like an olive branch, an acknowledgement that perhaps Tabitha was not as toxic as everyone seemed to believe. "See," Garrett said softly, "not everyone is against you." Before Tabitha could respond, there was a commotion near the food tables. One of the younger children, a boy of about 6, had climbed onto a table to reach something and had knocked over several dishes in the process. His mother rushed over, scolding, and other women moved to clean up the spill. It was exactly the kind of small disaster that would normally be attributed to Tabitha's presence. But she had been nowhere near the table. Garrett caught her eye and raised an eyebrow as if to say, "See." Accidents happen to everyone. The social continued without further incident, and as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, Garrett walked Tabitha to where the horses were tied. They had to ride back to her farm, and he would then continue to the ranch. "I had a wonderful time," Tabitha said, and meant it with her whole heart. "So did I," Garrett said. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Can I see you again? Maybe I could come by after work one evening this week." "I would like that," Tabitha said, her voice soft. "Good." He helped her onto her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Because I find I cannot stop thinking about you, Tabitha Wright, and I am not a man who usually gets distracted." The ride back to the farm was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the farmhouse, Thomas came out to greet them, and Garrett was invited in for coffee. They sat in the small parlor, talking about the social, about the ranch work, about the coming harvest. And Tabitha watched the two men she cared about most in the world form a friendship that felt as natural as breathing. When Garrett finally left to return to the ranch, he tipped his hat to Tabitha and said, "Until next time, Miss Wright." She stood on the porch and watched him ride away, her heart full in a way she had never experienced. Her father came to stand beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "He is a good man, Tabby. I know," she said. "That is what scares me." "Do not borrow trouble," Thomas said gently. "Let tomorrow worry about itself. For tonight just be happy," and she was. For that night and for the next several weeks as Garrett became a regular visitor to the Wright farm. He came by in the evenings after his work at the ranch, sometimes bringing small gifts. Wildflowers he had picked on the range, a ribbon for her hair that he had bought in town, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. They took walks together, sat on the porch talking until the stars came out and slowly, carefully, fell in love. Tabitha waited for disaster to strike. She braced herself for Garrett's horse to go lame, for him to be injured in a ranch accident, for some calamity to befall him as it had befallen Jacob Morrison and others who had shown interest in her. But days turned into weeks, and nothing happened. Garrett remained healthy and whole, his work at the ranch went well, and the only change in his circumstances was that he smiled more, laughed more, and could be found whistling while he worked. The ranch hands teased him about being smitten, but it was good-natured ribbing, and Garrett took it in stride. He spoke openly about courting Tabitha, and while some of the older hands warned him about her reputation, he dismissed their concerns with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. "I make my own luck," he told them, "and Tabitha Wright is the best luck I have ever had." It was July when Garrett first kissed her. They had been sitting by the creek that ran through the Wright property, their feet dangling in the cool water, talking about everything and nothing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and Garrett had been unusually quiet for several minutes. "What are you thinking about?" Tabitha asked. "About how I rode into Nebraska expecting nothing more than a job and a place to sleep," he said slowly. "And how I found something I did not even know I was looking for." Tabitha's heart began to beat faster. "What did you find?" He turned to look at her, his autumn water eyes serious and warm. "You, a home, a reason to put down roots instead of just drifting from place to place." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Tabitha, I know we have not known each other long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are not unlucky. You are the greatest fortune I could have ever hoped for." Tears spilled down Tabitha's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of something breaking open inside her that had been closed for far too long. "Garrett," she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs, and then he kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Tabitha felt as though every moment of her life had been leading to this one. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it is fast, and maybe I should wait longer to say it, but I am not good at hiding how I feel." "I love you too," Tabitha said, the words coming easily because they were true. "I have been trying not to, trying to protect you from whatever curse people think I carry, but I cannot help it. I love you, Garrett Young." They sat by the creek until the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans and promises in the way of young lovers everywhere. Garrett spoke of saving money to buy his own land someday, a place where they could build a life together. Tabitha dared to let herself dream of a future that included happiness, children, a home filled with love instead of superstition and fear. As summer deepened into August, their courtship became an accepted fact in Kearney. There were still those who muttered about Tabitha's bad luck, who predicted doom for the relationship, but others began to see that perhaps the doom was not coming. Garrett thrived at the Double R, earning the respect of the foreman and the other hands. No mysterious accidents befell him, no strange misfortunes. He was simply a hard-working cowboy who was courting a nice girl, and gradually, slowly, the town's attitude began to shift. Sarah Mitchell went out of her way to be friendly to Tabitha at the market, and her example encouraged other women to follow. The general store owner, who had always treated Tabitha with wary politeness, began asking after her father's health and complimenting her selections. Even old Henderson at the leather goods stall nodded to her when she passed, though he did not quite meet her eyes. But not everyone was pleased with this change. Martha Hensley, the banker's wife and the closest thing Kearney had to a social arbiter, had made a reputation of being the town's moral guardian. She had 3 daughters of her own, all of marriageable age, and she had long held that Tabitha was a bad influence. When it became clear that Garrett was serious about Tabitha, Martha took it upon herself to intervene. It happened on a Saturday morning in late August. Tabitha was at the market with her father when Martha approached, her face set in stern lines. She waited until Thomas was distracted by a conversation with another farmer, then pulled Tabitha aside. "Miss Wright, I feel it is my Christian duty to speak plainly with you," Martha said, her voice low but sharp. "About what, Mrs. Hensley?" Tabitha asked, though she had a sinking feeling she knew. "About Mr. Young. You must see that it is selfish of you to encourage his attentions. Your reputation, your history of misfortune, these things do not simply disappear because a handsome cowboy takes a fancy to you." Tabitha felt anger rise in her chest, hot and unfamiliar. She had spent so long accepting the town's judgment that she had forgotten she could fight back. "My history, as you call it, is a series of coincidences that people have chosen to interpret as a curse. Mr. Young does not believe in such superstitions, and frankly, neither do I anymore." Martha's eyes widened in shock. "You would risk his safety, his future, for your own desires. That is not the behavior of a good woman." "What I see," Tabitha said, her voice shaking but growing stronger, "is a woman who cannot stand to see someone else happy. Garrett cares for me and I for him, and we are not harming anyone. If you truly cared about Christian duty, you would practice kindness instead of judgment." She turned and walked away before Martha could respond, her whole body trembling with the force of what she had just done. She had never spoken back to someone like Martha Hensley before, had never defended herself so openly. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Her father found her a few minutes later, sitting on the edge of a wagon, taking deep breaths to calm herself. "Tabby, what happened?" she told him about the confrontation, half expecting him to be upset that she had been so bold, but Thomas just smiled and put his arm around her. "Good for you. It is about time you stood up for yourself. Your mother would be proud." "Do you really think so?" Tabitha asked. "I know so," Thomas said firmly. "She was the bravest woman I ever knew, and you are just like her." Word of the confrontation spread through town with the speed of wildfire. By the time Garrett came to visit that evening, he had already heard about it from 3 different people. He found Tabitha in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary, still working through her emotions. "I heard you put Martha Hensley in her place," he said by way of greeting. Tabitha sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with her sleeve. "Did the story make me sound like a shrew?" "It made you sound like a woman who knows her worth," Garrett said, crouching down beside her. "I am proud of you." She said I was being selfish, encouraging you. Garrett took the trowel from her hand and set it aside, then took both her hands in his. "Tabitha, look at me." He waited until she met his eyes. "You are not responsible for other people's superstitions. You are not cursed. And if I have to spend the rest of my life proving that to you and everyone else in this town, I will do it gladly." "The rest of your life," Tabitha repeated, her heart stuttering. "The rest of my life," Garrett confirmed. "Marry me, Tabitha. I know I should wait, should save more money, should ask your father first, but I cannot hold it in any longer. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and come home to you every evening. I want to prove to you and to this whole damn town that the only fortune I need is you." Tabitha felt tears streaming down her face, but she was laughing too, overwhelmed with joy and disbelief and a fierce, bright happiness. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Garrett whooped and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around in the middle of the garden, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Tabitha kissed him back with all the love and hope and gratitude in her heart. They went inside to tell her father, who was not at all surprised and gave his blessing with tears in his eyes. "I always hoped you would find someone who could see you clearly," Thomas said, embracing them both. "Welcome to the family, Garrett." They decided on a simple wedding, to be held in September before the harvest became too demanding. The church was booked, and the minister was notified, and Tabitha began the preparations with a mix of excitement and lingering nervousness. She could not quite shake the fear that something would go wrong, that her bad luck would manifest at the worst possible moment. But as the days passed and the wedding approached, everything went smoothly. Her father sold a piece of equipment for a good price, giving them extra money for wedding expenses. Sarah Mitchell offered to help make Tabitha's dress, and several other women joined in, turning it into a communal effort that felt like acceptance in a way nothing else had. Garrett's foreman at the Double R gave him 2 weeks off for the wedding and honeymoon, and some of the ranch hands chipped in to buy them a proper bed as a wedding gift. The night before the wedding, Tabitha lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. She had heard of weddings where the bride fell ill, where storms destroyed the celebration, where 100 small disasters added up to ruin the day. She prayed harder than she had ever prayed, asking God not for perfection, but simply for the chance to marry the man she loved without calamity. The morning of September 15th dawned cool and clear, a perfect late summer day. Tabitha dressed in the gown that the women of Kearney had helped create, a simple but beautiful white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. Sarah came to help with her hair, pinning it up with flowers and a few precious pearl pins that had belonged to her own mother. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her work. "Garrett is a lucky man." "He keeps saying I am the lucky one," Tabitha said, smoothing the skirt of her dress. "Then you are lucky together," Sarah said wisely. "That is the best kind of marriage." The church was full when Tabitha arrived with her father. It seemed the whole town had turned out, some out of genuine goodwill, others out of curiosity to see if the unlucky Wright girl would make it to her own wedding. Tabitha saw Garrett waiting at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him in his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed. His eyes locked on her with such love that she felt her nervousness melt away. Thomas walked her down the aisle, and Tabitha kept her eyes on Garrett, on the future they were about to begin together. When her father placed her hand in Garrett's, she felt the rightness of it in her bones, as though every step of her life had been leading to this moment. The minister began the ceremony, his voice carrying through the church. Tabitha and Garrett spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other through all the days of their lives. When it came time to exchange rings, simple gold bands that Garrett had bought with his saved wages, Tabitha's hands were steady. She slid the ring onto his finger, and he did the same for her. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with such tenderness that she heard several women in the congregation sigh. They walked back down the aisle together as Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Young, and Tabitha felt as though she were floating. The reception was held in the same space behind the church where the social had been, with food and music and dancing. People came up to offer congratulations, and Tabitha saw genuine happiness on many faces, including some she had not expected. Even Martha Hensley approached, though she looked as though the words cost her something. "I wish you both well," she said stiffly, and Tabitha chose to take it as the peace offering it probably was. The celebration lasted into the evening, and Tabitha danced with her new husband until her feet ached, but she did not care. Nothing went wrong. No one was hurt, no disasters struck, and gradually Tabitha allowed herself to believe that perhaps Garrett had been right all along. Perhaps she had never been cursed. Perhaps life was simply full of random chances, and she had let herself be defined by them for too long. When it was time to leave, Garrett lifted her onto his horse in front of him, and they rode through the darkness to the small house on the edge of the ranch property that the foreman had agreed to let them use. It was tiny, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs, and Tabitha felt her heart swell with gratitude and love as Garrett carried her over the threshold. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Garrett held her close and whispered, "See, no disasters, no bad luck. Just you and me, exactly as it should be. You were right," Tabitha said softly. "About everything." "Not everything," Garrett said with a smile she could hear in his voice. "I am still terrible at the harmonica." She laughed and kissed him, and they spent their first night as husband and wife wrapped in each other's arms, full of hope for the future. The first months of their marriage were happy despite the hard work. Garrett continued at the Double R while Tabitha managed their small household and helped her father with the farm when she could. They fell into comfortable routines, learning each other's habits and quirks, building a life together one day at a time. Winter came early that year, and with it challenges that tested them but never broke them. The small house was drafty, and they huddled together for warmth on the coldest nights, talking and dreaming about the future. Garrett spoke of his plan to save enough money to buy land of his own, to build a ranch where they could raise cattle and horses and children. Tabitha shared her dreams too, quieter dreams of a home filled with love and laughter, of being part of a community that accepted her, of growing old beside this man who had seen her worth when no one else could. In the spring, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett on a mild April evening as they sat on the porch of their little house watching the sunset. He was quiet for a long moment after she shared the news, and Tabitha felt a flicker of worry. "Garrett, are you all right?" He turned to her with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face. "I am more than all right. I am going to be a father. We are going to be parents." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. "This is the best news you could have given me." They told her father together the next day, and Thomas wept openly, overjoyed at the prospect of a grandchild. The women of Kearney, led by Sarah Mitchell, organized to help Tabitha prepare for the baby, donating blankets and clothes and advice. Even Martha Hensley contributed a beautifully knitted baby bonnet, which Tabitha accepted with grace and genuine thanks. As her belly grew through the summer, Tabitha found herself happier than she had ever imagined possible. The fears that had haunted her for so long had faded to distant whispers. She still had moments of worry, particularly as her due date approached, but Garrett was always there to reassure her, to remind her that they would face whatever came together. The baby was born on a cold November morning, a healthy boy with Garrett's dark hair and Tabitha's honey-colored eyes. They named him Thomas Garrett Young, after both his grandfathers, though they called him Tommy. Garrett held his son with such awe and gentleness that Tabitha fell in love with him all over again. The first time old Henderson saw them in town with the baby, he stopped them on the street. "Fine-looking boy," he said gruffly. "Looks like he has his father's luck." "He has his mother's," Garrett corrected firmly, "and we are all the better for it." Life settled into a new rhythm with Tommy in it. The baby was healthy and happy, and Tabitha discovered a fierce, protective love she had not known she was capable of. Garrett was a devoted father, rising in the night to help with feedings, making silly faces to coax smiles from their son, singing off key lullabies that somehow always worked to soothe the baby to sleep. 2 years passed, and then 3. Garrett was promoted to foreman at the Double R when the old foreman retired, a position that came with better pay and more responsibility. They saved every penny they could, and on Tommy's 4th birthday, Garrett came home with news that made Tabitha cry with joy. "I found land," he said, his excitement barely contained. 20 acres between here and town with good water and good grass. The owner is willing to sell at a price we can afford if we make a good down payment. We could build our own place, Tabitha, our own ranch." They bought the land that summer, and with help from the ranch hands and some of the men from town, they began building a house. It was not large, but it was well made and solid, with a bedroom for them, a room for Tommy, and space for the children they hoped would come. They moved in that fall, and Tabitha planted a garden in the spring while Garrett began building up a small herd of cattle. Life was hard, as it always was on the frontier, but it was good. They worked from dawn to dusk, but they did it together, and at the end of each day they had something to show for their efforts. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved helping his father with the animals and following his mother around the garden. Tabitha gave birth to a daughter when Tommy was 6, a little girl they named Grace, who had her father's smile and her mother's determination. The ranch prospered slowly but surely. Garrett had a gift for working with horses, and he began taking in animals to train, earning extra money and a reputation for quality work. Tabitha raised chickens and sold eggs, grew vegetables that she sold at the market, and managed their household with careful efficiency. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The town of Kearney had long since stopped whispering about Tabitha's bad luck. Too many years had passed without disaster. Too much evidence that she was simply an ordinary woman who had been the victim of coincidence and superstition. Some people probably still believed in her curse, but they kept it to themselves, especially when faced with the clear evidence of the thriving young family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Tabitha on a rare day away from the ranch, leaving the children with her father. They rode out to a place he had found, a high ridge overlooking the valley where their land spread out below them, the house they had built visible in the distance. "You remember the first time we met?" Garrett asked, sitting beside her on the grass. "When I rode up with my limping horse and you were so worried that your bad luck would somehow affect me." "I remember," Tabitha said, leaning against his shoulder. "I was so scared of what might happen to you, of letting myself hope. And now, "Now I know you were right all along," Tabitha said, taking his hand and lacing their fingers together. "I was never unlucky. I just had not found my fortune yet." Garrett raised their joined hands and kissed her knuckles. "You are my greatest fortune, Tabitha Young. You and our children, this land, this life we have built. Every single day I thank God that my horse picked up that stone and brought me to your door." They sat together as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Tabitha thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, so convinced of her own cursedness, so afraid to let herself be happy. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. The woman she had become knew her worth, knew that love and hard work mattered more than superstition, knew that the only luck that mattered was the kind you made for yourself. Time continued its steady march, bringing changes and challenges and joys in equal measure. Tommy grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Grace proved to be a natural with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and kindness. Tabitha gave birth to 2 more children, twin boys they named Samuel and Simon, who brought chaos and laughter to their household in equal measure. Thomas Wright lived to see all his grandchildren, spending his final years helping on the ranch and telling stories to the children about their mother's childhood. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, and the whole town turned out for his funeral, a testament to the respect he had earned through a lifetime of quiet integrity. Tabitha mourned him deeply, but found comfort in knowing he had lived to see her happy, to know that his faith in her had been justified. The ranch continued to grow. Garrett proved to be as skilled at business as he was at working with animals, and their reputation spread beyond Kearney. People came from miles around to buy horses trained by Garrett Young, and the income allowed them to expand their land and their herd. They hired hands to help with the work, and Garrett treated them fairly, earning loyalty and respect. Tabitha became known in her own right, not as the unlucky girl, but as a woman of strength and wisdom. She helped organize charity efforts in town, worked with Sarah Mitchell to establish a small school, and became someone younger women came to for advice. When newcomers to Kearney asked about her, they heard not about curses and bad luck, but about the woman who had overcome superstition through determination and the love of a good man. Martha Hensley, grown old and softened by time, came to Tabitha one day when they were both shopping at the general store. "I owe you an apology," Martha said, her voice shaky with age. "For the things I said before your marriage, I was wrong and I am sorry." Tabitha, now a woman in her 40s with silver beginning to thread through her honey-colored hair, smiled and took Martha's hand. "We were all younger and less wise. I forgive you, Martha. I forgave you long ago." The years rolled on, marked by seasons and celebrations, by births and deaths, by the steady accumulation of a life well lived. Tommy married a girl from a neighboring ranch and gave them grandchildren. Grace found love with a veterinarian who came to Kearney from back east, a kind man who appreciated her spirit and her way with animals. The twins, inseparable as always, decided to seek their fortune further west, promising to write often and visit when they could. Garrett and Tabitha grew old together, their bodies marked by hard work and time, but their love as strong as ever. They sat on the porch of the house they had built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and marveled at how far they had come from that chance meeting 30 years before. You ever think about how different things could have been? Tabitha asked one evening as they watched the sunset, a ritual they had maintained through all their years together. "If you had ridden past our farm that day, if you had listened to the people who warned you about me." Garrett took her hand, his fingers rough and calloused but his touch still gentle. "I think about how lucky I am that I did not. How lucky I am that I trusted my own judgment instead of other people's superstitions. How lucky I am that you gave me a chance despite your fears." "I was never the lucky one," Tabitha said softly. "You were. You were the one who saw past the surface, who had the courage to go against everyone's expectations." "We were both lucky," Garrett said firmly. "Lucky to find each other, lucky to have built this life, lucky to have loved each other through all of it. That is the only luck that matters." As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Tabitha leaned her head on Garrett's shoulder, just as she had done 1,000 times before, and felt the deep contentment of a life lived fully and well. She thought about the girl she had been, so afraid of her own shadow, so convinced that she was cursed to bring misfortune to everyone around her. She thought about the moment Garrett had caught that falling plate in her father's kitchen, turning what could have been another disaster into nothing worth noting. She thought about all the years since, each one a testament to the power of love and determination over superstition and fear. "Thank you," she whispered to the man beside her. "For what?" Garrett asked. "For seeing me, for believing in me, for being stubborn enough not to give up even when I tried to push you away for your own good." Garrett chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I am a cowboy, Tabitha. We are nothing if not stubborn. Besides, you made it easy to believe. All I had to do was pay attention to who you really were instead of who everyone said you should be." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, and Tabitha reflected on the truth that had taken her so long to learn and accept. She had never been unlucky. She had simply been a girl who experienced the normal accidents and misfortunes of life, in a town that chose to see patterns where none existed. It had taken Garrett's unwavering faith to show her that she had the power to define herself, that she could choose to reject the label others had placed on her. More than that, she had learned that love was the greatest fortune of all. Not romantic love alone, though that was certainly part of it, but the love of family and friends, the love that came from building something meaningful with your own hands, the love that grew from treating people with kindness and respect, regardless of what others said. Garrett had given her all of that and more, and in return, she had given him a life full of purpose and joy. As they finally rose to go inside, Garrett paused to look back at the land they had worked so hard to build. The house stood solid and welcoming, light glowing from the windows where their children and grandchildren were gathering for their weekly family dinner. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, the fences sturdy, the fields productive. Everything they saw was a product of their labor, their love, and their refusal to give up even when things were difficult. "Not bad for an unlucky girl and a wandering cowboy," Garrett said with a grin. "Not bad at all," Tabitha agreed, smiling up at the man who had changed her life simply by refusing to believe in curses. They walked inside together, hand in hand as they had been for 30 years, to join their family for dinner. The house was full of noise and laughter, grandchildren running between adults, dishes being passed, stories being told. It was everything Tabitha had dreamed of during those dark years when she thought happiness was impossible for someone like her. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Garrett and Tabitha prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of long marriage. As they lay together in the darkness, Tabitha spoke the words that had been on her heart all day. "I love you, Garrett Young. Thank you for being my greatest fortune." "And you mine," Garrett replied, pulling her close. "Always and forever, my love." Years continued to pass in the peaceful rhythm they had established. Their ranch became one of the most respected in the county, known for quality livestock and fair dealing. Garrett trained horses until his hands grew too stiff with arthritis, and then he supervised while Tommy took over the work, passing on knowledge and techniques he had learned over a lifetime. Tabitha kept her garden until she was well into her 60s, finally allowing Grace's daughter to take over the bulk of the work, while she provided advice and enjoyed the fruits of others' labor for a change. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the house bursting with family and love. The town of Kearney threw them a party in the church hall, the same space where they had danced at their wedding so many years before. People came from all over the county to honor the couple who had built such a remarkable life together, and Tabitha looked around at the gathering with wonder, seeing how far she had come from that frightened girl who believed herself cursed. Sarah Mitchell, now elderly herself, pulled Tabitha aside during the celebration. "I am proud to call you my friend," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "You have shown everyone in this town what courage and love can do." "I could not have done it without good people like you," Tabitha said, embracing her friend. "You were one of the first to treat me with kindness when everyone else saw only bad luck." "You were never unlucky," Sarah said firmly, "just young and afraid. But you found a man who helped you see your own strength, and that made all the difference." As the party continued around them, Garrett found Tabitha and drew her onto the dance floor. They moved slowly now, their bodies not as limber as they once were, but they moved together with the ease of a lifetime of practice. Around them, younger couples danced, including several of their grandchildren with sweethearts of their own, and Tabitha felt the beautiful continuity of it all, the way love and life continued from generation to generation. "You remember our wedding dance?" Garrett asked, his voice rougher with age but still warm. "I remember being terrified I would trip and fall," Tabitha admitted. "I remember you telling me we would be terrible together." "And we were," Garrett said with a laugh. "But we got better with practice." "We did," Tabitha agreed. "We got better at everything with practice. Dancing, ranching, loving, living. All of it." Winter came to Nebraska that year with particular cold, and Garrett caught a chill that developed into pneumonia. Despite the doctor's best efforts and Tabitha's devoted nursing, he grew steadily weaker. On a January morning, with snow falling softly outside and his family gathered around his bed, Garrett squeezed Tabitha's hand and smiled at her. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I proved you were not unlucky. Look at this life we built." "You did," Tabitha said through her tears. "You kept every promise you ever made to me." "Not everyone," Garrett said, his breathing labored. "I promised to love you forever, and forever is not finished yet." "Then you will have to love me from wherever you are going," Tabitha said, holding his hand against her cheek. "And I will love you from here, until it is my time to join you." Garrett's eyes held hers with the same intensity they had held that first day when he caught her falling plate. "You were my greatest fortune, Tabitha Wright Young. The best decision I ever made was to ignore the warnings and trust my heart." "And you were mine," Tabitha whispered. "My fortune, my love, my whole heart." He died peacefully a few hours later, surrounded by the family they had created together, and Tabitha held him until the end. The grief was profound, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, but underneath it was gratitude for 45 years of love, for a life rich with meaning and purpose, for every moment they had shared. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county. Garrett had been respected and liked, known for his integrity and skill, his kindness and his unwavering loyalty to his family. As Tabitha stood beside his grave, supported by her children and grandchildren, she thought about the young cowboy who had ridden up to her father's farm with a limping horse and changed her life forever. She lived for another 5 years after Garrett's death, years filled with family and quiet contentment. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories of their grandfather and the life they had built together. She worked in her garden when the weather was fine, sat on the porch watching the sunset every evening, and spoke to Garrett as though he were still beside her, because in many ways he was. On a spring morning in her 71st year, Tabitha did not wake up. Her daughter Grace found her in her bed, peaceful and still, a slight smile on her face as though she had seen something wonderful in her dreams. On the nightstand beside her bed was the photograph from her wedding day, showing a young woman with hope in her eyes and a cowboy with a determined smile, ready to face the world together. They buried her next to Garrett under the oak tree on the ridge overlooking their ranch, and the whole town of Kearney turned out to honor a woman who had overcome superstition and fear to build a remarkable life. At the service, Tommy spoke about his mother's courage and his father's faith, about how they had proven that love was stronger than any curse, real or imagined. Grace talked about her mother's kindness and strength, about how she had taught her children that they had the power to define themselves, that they did not have to accept the limitations others tried to place on them. The twins, home from their adventures out west, shared stories of their mother's wisdom and their father's devotion, painting a picture of a marriage built on respect and genuine partnership. But perhaps the most touching tribute came from Martha Hensley's granddaughter, a young woman who had known Tabitha only in her later years. "Mrs. Young taught me that the labels others give us do not have to define us," she said, her voice clear in the spring air. "She taught me that courage means standing up for yourself even when you are afraid, and that love means seeing the best in people even when others see only their flaws. She taught me that the greatest fortune in life is not money or land, but the people we love and who love us in return." As the service concluded and people began to drift away, an old leather-bound journal was found among Tabitha's possessions. She had kept it sporadically over the years, recording thoughts and memories, and Grace sat down one evening to read through it. Near the end, dated just a few weeks before her mother's death, was an entry that made Grace cry and smile at the same time. It read, "I spent the first 21 years of my life believing I was cursed, that my very existence brought misfortune to everyone around me. Then Garrett rode into my life and showed me a different truth. He showed me that I had the power to choose what I believed about myself, that I could reject the fear and superstition that had defined me for so long. He gave me the courage to stand up for myself, the strength to build a life worth living, and the love that made every day a gift. People called me unlucky, but Garrett said I was his greatest fortune, and in saying so, he became mine. We built a good life together, full of hard work and joy, challenges and triumphs. I regret nothing except perhaps the years I wasted believing the worst about myself. But even those years served a purpose, because they taught me to appreciate the gift of being truly seen and loved. I am ready now to join my husband, my fortune, my love. I have lived well, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy of family and happiness. That is all any person can hope for, and I am grateful for every moment." Grace shared the journal entry with her siblings, and they agreed it perfectly captured their mother's journey from frightened girl to confident woman, from someone defined by others' fears to someone who defined herself through love and courage. They had the passage engraved on a stone that they placed between their parents' graves, a permanent reminder of the truth Tabitha had learned and lived. Years passed, and the ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's management and eventually his children's. The story of Garrett and Tabitha became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It became a story about the importance of looking past surface appearances, about the courage it takes to love someone when others say you should not, about the power of faith and determination to overcome any obstacle. The people of Kearney eventually forgot that Tabitha Wright had ever been called unlucky. What they remembered instead was a love story for the ages, a tale of a cowboy and a farmer's daughter who built a life together against the odds, who proved that the only fortune that mattered was the one you created with your own hands and heart. The story became part of the town's history, a reminder that people were not defined by others' superstitions, but by their own choices and actions. The small house where Garrett and Tabitha had first lived stood empty for a while after her death, but eventually, Tommy renovated it for one of his sons, and it became home to yet another generation of Youngs. The main house remained the heart of the ranch, always full of family, always echoing with laughter and love, a living testament to what two people could build when they refused to let fear and superstition dictate their lives. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Nebraska plains and painted the sky in brilliant colors, it was said you could sometimes see two figures standing on the ridge, looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build, still together, even in death as they had been in life. Whether this was true or simply another story did not really matter. What mattered was the legacy they left behind. A family, a thriving ranch, and the unshakable truth that love was indeed the greatest fortune of all, stronger than any curse, more powerful than any superstition, and lasting far beyond the limits of a single lifetime.